Hi, people. I've just watched a segment of GB News, which I don't always watch. I don't entirely like the direction they've gone in, but I think that and I don't like using this term, but when the mainstream media fails to cover important subjects, then it's going to be taken up by alternative sources. And sometimes GB News is good at that. It's kind of the same outlook I have with some of the tabloids. I don't necessarily like or agree with the editorial line, but if the mainstream fails to talk about issues, then it will be picked up elsewhere. So that's the caveat. Um, so it was a segment by Andrew Doyle, who I've time for. I think he's quite a sensible individual from what I've seen. And he was talking about an incident that happened in New Zealand, Auckland, I think, at that Women Speak event. And I have a few names here, so I'm just hope I get them right. Um, Kelly J. Keane, aka Posey Parker, is a women's rights activist. Apparently, she's quite outspoken, but basically, she was speaking at this event, Let Women Speak, um, which is basically a campaign to insist that women have the right to talk about biology. And a bunch of trans activists slash thugs um, basically tried to attack her. There were stewards there who done the best they could, so fair play to them. But it was really quite ugly scenes. And there's footage of this, and she got pelted with stuff. She got some sort of tomato soup, I think it was, thrown over her. Uh, and we're not talking about a bit of heckling here. These were really violent, aggressive scenes from men, hardly thugs. I have to say, as a man, generally, it makes me uncomfortable to see a woman terrorized or intimidated that way. I don't like to see it with anyone, frankly. Um, and I think it's not long before something happens and someone gets killed because I think the trans lobby is out of control, quite honestly. Now, I want to make a caveat here. I'm not talking about all trans people. There may be trans people out there who say, oh, but they don't represent me. The problem is, like any movement, something starts getting very vocal and in your face and aggressive, that's a bit that's going to get attention. So, maybe not all trans people agree with that approach, but many do, quite frankly. Um, anyway, Doyle was speaking to two women's activists on this issue, Helen Joyce and Ella Whelan, and they were talking about how in Speaker's Corner in London at the women's event, there's a lack of consistency in policing because the police were simply walking away from that Women Speak event. They said that the counter demonstrators, i.e., the trans activists, had the freedom of speech, but you know, shouting someone down with Valenzuela megaphones is not freedom of speech. That's just the bully pulpit. Um, I do think the police are really in a bad way at the moment because I think they're so inconsistent. You know, police chiefs are getting their officers to investigate non-crime incidents, hate incidents, so called, which is someone using the wrong pronoun online, and they're wasting public resources into that. I think the Home Secretary is right to call it out and to call for an end to that. Because, the police can't complain that they've got stretched resources when they're wasting time on that. So I really think the police have done themselves no favours in terms of their inconsistency. Um, I mean, just generally, I think they need to greatly improve their attitude to women. You know, and again, everything I'm talking about here isn't generalizations. I'm not talking about every officer. I'm not talking about every trans person. But clearly, there's something very rotten going on when a woman is bullied and terrorized into submission, basically, um, and that's heralded as some sort of good thing. Now, disgracefully, some of the big outlets in New Zealand, for example, News Hub, they tried to portray this as she's a puppet of the far right, and they claimed that she was doing some sort of symbol, and this was quite shocking. Andrew Doyle showed this in a segment. Rather than showing a far right symbol, all she was doing was adjusting the zip on her top in an interview or in a podcast. Um, so that is a shameful, you know, distortion of truth, and I think YouTube should apologize. But it's just such an upside down situation that men can violently harass a woman, and that's applauded as progress. And if this was any other sort of situation, it would rightly be condemned. But because they hide behind the trans lobby, they're heralded. I have to say, and this is absolutely candid, if I was ever in this sort of situation, and there was a woman in my life, and trans lobbyists violently threatened her, I would risk arrest myself. I would intervene physically and defend her. And I don't give a damn. I would have no problem punching a biological man in the face to protect a woman. None. I'd get arrested for it, but it would be worth it because these trans lobby activists are such cowards, they're such thugs. And, Doyle made a good point, and this came up in the discussion, which was that, you know, like the far left have often done, when you throw Nazi into something, then anything goes. Because if someone's a Nazi, that's the worst thing you can be. So, murdering them or killing them or violently threatening them, that's okay because they're a Nazi. And he cited an example of a university professor, no less, who still has a Facebook presence, actually saying it was okay to murder Nazis and homophobes and so on. The left is sickening in its hypocrisy. This particular segment of the left, I should say, when they talk about be kind, be tolerant, or accept to those who don't see the world exactly as they do. Um, Now, on the issue of the far right, I have no doubt that there will be some probably unpleasant factions that will sort of latch on to some of these counter woke movements or counter woke narratives who will, say that they're on the side of Posey Park or whatever, and some of them might be white supremacists. Apparently, she was talking about the rights of married women. Some white supremacist. She was talking about the rights of married women to have a voice. Um, But this is what's so infuriating about the regressive left these days. They just tag everyone with the same brush. That if you don't see the world the way they do, then you're a Nazi or you're dog whistling to the far right. It happens time and time and time again, and I'm so sick of it. I've had it happen to me, and I'm not saying it's the same situation. I haven't had this sort of in my face fuggery, but I've been called not a Nazi, but I've been accused of pandering to the far right because I said there's a nuanced debate to be had about immigration. Not even a nuanced debate, there's an open debate to be had. But there is a deep, deep intolerance with the regressive left, and it's abhorrent when they will not practice what they preach. One of my subscribers, I think it was you, Toxicolic Grenade, if you happen to be watching this, you brought up the issue of double hypocrisy. And I think you're right. I think it's when And I think I gathered this correctly. It's when you're not only, most people are probably guilty of hypocrisy on some level, but when you're not only criticizing others for something you've done yourself, you're doubling down on it. I think I'll be honest, I didn't 100% get your meaning of that, but I think definitely some of that is going on. But the narrative is very distorted because time and time again we hear about how persecuted trans people are. Actually, when you consider the amount of airtime that they disproportionately get, the trans lobby I'm talking about, in so many media outlets and so much of social media, I mean, if someone uses the wrong pronouns or they talk about these issues, there's a very real chance they could be censored on social media. And I'm not talking about, bullying trans people and targeting individuals. I'm talking about simply saying that biology matters. In fact, I went to find Posey Parker's Instagram page and it was gone. They've obviously taken it down. This is actually quite disturbing. I think these big media companies need to get a backbone, and if they say they truly want plurality of opinion and free speech, they need to be consistent about that. I'm not talking about obvious cases where people are, sending threats, but they're not consistent in this anyway. Um, Trans activists regularly make violent threats and get away with it. And I'm concerned. I think it's only a matter of time before a woman is killed. I mean, anyone who questions them gets threatened, but women in particular, there seems to be a particularly deep misogynistic hatred for women who insist that their rights matter. And again, a caveat here: I'm far from a feminist. I have not always agreed with the positions of Western third wave feminists. I think sometimes they've been quite bigoted towards men in general and guilty of double standards. But you know, I, I've I've made my views on that quite candid. But I think we're in a situation now where the trans lobby is so aggressive and so out of control and so misogynistic that women have to be defended, and I support those women, those feminists, 100% in insisting that biology matters. There was a case actually. This just shows how upside down this situation is, where a woman, in inverted commas, assaulted another woman. Well, actually, it was trans woman, a man, right, a biological bloke, and he looked like it. He had stubble. It was clearly a man. It was in North Yorkshire. This was floating around social media a while back, but it was almost laughable if it wasn't serious. In Scotland, of course, this issue brought down Nicola Sturgeon. So that's the good news. There is some pushback against it. I think it's the Athletic. I forget the exact name of the organisation, but the World Athletic Council or big governing body has said that biological men cannot compete as women anymore. Good. So there is some pushback against this. Some common sense still prevails, but my concern is by using this victimhood narrative, which apparently this idea that trans people are the most persecuted group apparently comes from a very specific thing, which was black Brazilian trans prostitutes who apparently were murdered. Now, I'm not saying that trans people never face threats and they never face discrimination. There was an awful case in the UK recently in Sheffield, I believe, a young trans person was murdered. That's awful. No one should have to go through that. And I do genuinely have sympathy for people who are struggling with gender dysphoria and identity issues. I think there should be compassion there. Um, but there is so much that needs to be critiqued about the way this debate is going. For example, they talk about tags and how about, oh, we don't want to use demeaning terms about trans people, but they have no problem labeling their opponent to cisgender, which is a completely made up term. It's only come into vernacular in recent years, so they've just totally made it up. Oh, you don't get a right to label yourself the way you want. So if someone doesn't appreciate being called a cisgender, oh no, you can't argue with nature. Um, and there's so many inherent contradictions in their positions. I mean, uh, this idea that sex is a social construct and we're not going to pander to society's pressures, but we demand that you consider, you use our pronouns. So there's just a lot of inherent contradictions. Um, and there's counter groups out there that can put a lot of this more eloquently than I can. There's one that's based in Australia, Binary. I think they have some very sensible posts, and this is not some sort of hate group. This isn't, pushing hatred against trans people. It's simply standing up for common sense and standing up for women. And it's interesting, often these sinister, hateful, transphobe Nazis, when you actually look at what they're saying, they're never, threatening violence against trans people. They're never dehumanizing trans people. All they're doing is saying that biology matters. Look at the way J.K. Rowling has been utterly vilified, and I absolutely salute her for standing her ground and not pandering to these thugs. But more people need to support her, and other women who take a stand on this. As a man, I want to play a small part and say I support women in this. You know, so if you're a trans person, I'm not against you, but if you think that your rights mean that you can yell in a woman's face simply because she is saying that biology matters, she is not threatening your life. She is not saying you should have no rights. What she's saying is that there is a very specific issue going on here where there has to be, safe spaces for biological women, prisons, changing rooms, and so on. That is simply common sense. The LGB Alliance has been accused of transphobia because they've turned against some militant tactics of the trans lobby. But that's not surprising because, for instance, lesbian women who have refused to date trans women on the grounds that they like women, they're attracted to women, they've been smeared as transphobes. And one of the most obnoxious terms is TERF, trans exclusive radical feminists. But that term is bandied about to dehumanize them. And it's kind of used as a buzzword to target them. So if a woman is smeared as a TERF, then she's fair game for vilification and for being labelled a Nazi. She's a TERF, so let's just call her a Nazi as well. Let's just threaten her. Keir Starmer needs to get some backbone because this is rife in the Labour ranks. Um, and I'm just sick of trans lobby behaving this way. If they really want to get public sympathy, they need to earn it. And that means not bullying and terrorizing women. And again, there will be trans people out there who probably agree with me. You know, um, I think, yeah, you can have a respectful debate. And I mean, personally, for instance, I wouldn't just deliberately use the wrong pronoun just to aggravate someone. But I refuse point blank to stand to lies to say that someone who's born a biological man can ever be a woman. They could be a trans woman, legally speaking, but they are not a woman, and they never will be. And it's this crazy, insane, upside down situation where basic truth is bigotry. It's just it's sick, actually. Um, but for all this talk about trans people being the most persecuted group, they have a hell of a lot of backing in the media and in social media, particularly. Is anyone who speaks out against this narrative risks being censored. So who really has the upper hand here? Who has the upper hand between an angry mob, and just it's disgraceful that the New Zealand police done nothing to stop that, um, or a woman on her own just trying to have a voice. She's not stirring up violence or hatred against trans people. And as for the far right thing, you know, if far right types infiltrate themselves into that movement, it's into the counter narrative. That's unfortunate, but that's what they tend to do. I think it's obscene to say that because they're sort of hijacking this. It's a bit like, I don't want to go too left field here, but the principle of all lives matter is absolutely true. All lives matter. Yet that was associated with the far right because the far right started using it. So therefore, it was like they've got ownership of it. Like only far right people say that. Yet it's literally the most egalitarian, equal thing you can say. So yeah, this is something that concerns me, and I think Andrew Doyle was spot on. I'll put a link to his segment. But if you are one of those people who say that it's transphobia to even say that biology matters, you're part of the problem. And if you're bandying around terms like turf and so on, I'm not saying you have to absolutely agree with those feminist speakers. I'll probably disagree with them in other areas, but the basic principle, they just want a voice, and they're not inciting violence. They're not the ones getting in people's faces. I mean, some of the Doyle showed screenshots of some of the supporters of this trans mob, and it was disgusting. People saying things like they were getting turned on by the violence, and it's basically sociopathic. Um, and I salute her courage, but women shouldn't have to stand alone. Men need to be speaking out as well and saying it is wrong that these biological men think they can bully women and hiding behind, the trans lobby to do it.